All right, let's look at layers in Photoshop. So here I am, I just started the program up again. I'm going to create a new document. And this time let's go 5 by 5 inches at 300 pixels per inch, RGB, background white, create. Right? And I am still in the Essentials workspace, right? And I have a double row over here in the toolbar. And I close down this library, which I don't really need. I can see my palettes and I can see the layer palette right there. See, layers. All right. Now, the layer palette is the most important part of Photoshop. It's kind of the command center. You always have to be aware of what layer you're on and to work correctly with layers. So we're going to really scrutinize this whole palette and look at everything, every part of it in detail. All right. So first off, we have just a solid background, right? So normally when you're painting in Photoshop, you paint on a blank or transparent layer above the background, so you're not deleting or obliterating what's there when you paint, right? It gives you flexibility to edit things. So let's fill the background with clouds. And what you want to do is make 2 different colors for your foreground and background. All right, this is one of the places that, this is one of the things that uses 2 colors here. All right, so I have 2 colors. I'm going to go to filter. Now, all these filters, right, are a whole bunch of pretty much toys that you can play with. I mean, some of them are kind of technical, but there's not much that you can do with these that you can't just control Z and undo it. So they that do kind of cool things. So anyway, what I'm looking at now is filter, render, clouds. Okay, so it fills my screen with or my image with clouds made of these 2 colors. If I go filter, render, difference clouds, that applies another layer of clouds on top of this with a blending mode. Remember we talked about the blending modes in the last video, with a blending mode of difference instead of normal, and it creates something like that, which is pretty weird. But if I go to filter, it remembers the last filter I ran, so I kind of keep hitting that a bunch of times, and it gets more and more kind of vermiculated and interesting looking. And the colors are sort of opposite each time. And we'll look at this more later, but there's also under image and then adjustments, there's a bunch of things I can do to control what my image looks like. So maybe since this is a little bright and I'm going to be painting over it, I'm going to go to maybe hue saturation, and I can change the hue of this thing. And I can make it more saturated or less saturated, and I can make it lighter or darker. We'll look at all these image adjustments in greater detail later. Or I can hit colorize, which makes it all a tint of one color. I think I'll leave it like that. All right, so this will be my background. Now, let's make a new layer. Okay, so down the bottom of the layer palette, there's multiple ways to make a new layer, but the bottom of the layer palette is a little thing that looks like a box with a plus in the middle of it. All right, that's going to make a new layer. Up until I think this version of Photoshop 2020, Adobe always used the same icon for new anything, which was a page with a corner turned over, is what it looked like. So if you were in the swatch palette, a new swatch looked like that, you know, that icon meant it'll make a new swatch. If you were in, you know, paths, it would make a new path. Whatever you were in, that icon means new, whatever it is. So, but now they've changed it for whatever reason to a square with a plus inside of it. I don't know why, but anyway, if I click on that, now you will see in the layer palette, there's a new layer there with nothing on it. All right, and so let's get a bright our paintbrush, right? And you can hit the left or right bracket key to make it bigger or smaller. Get some nice bright color that contrasts with the background. And I'm going to put in number 1 because we're on layer 1. And let's now make another layer. Okay. So another way to make a layer is if you go to the layer palette menu, right? Every palette has a menu. It's in the upper right corner there, and it contains a bunch of stuff, right? We can also get a lot of that stuff by right-clicking on a layer. It may not be exactly the same list, kind of depends on the layer. But if I go here, and I'm going to do new layer. Now, here's one thing that's different. When we clicked on this button down here, right, it just made a new layer. And it made it with all, by accepting all the defaults. If you go up here and go new layer, see it has a dot, dot, dot at the end of it. The dot, dot, dot is in computer language, or computer human interface terminology, means it's going to open some interface before it executes. Okay, so here it is, and I just get a chance to change some of these things. When I hit the button down at the bottom, it just accepts all these without changing them. It's all stuff you could change later. You know, it's just a chance to name the layer, change the blending mode, change the opacity. Okay, so I'm just going to leave it at layer 2. All right. So for layer 2, I'm going to make my brush harder, and it's purple, and here's layer 2. Right? Now, what makes layers important is if I go to the move tool, right, top left on the toolbar, I can move the contents of the layer around, and it didn't, you know, if I had done it all in the background layer, it would have gotten rid of the blue clouds that are underneath where I painted, right? Because that's just one layer of pixels. If I want to go to a different layer, like layer 1, I just click on that so it's active, right? So the active layer, and I don't even have to click right on the 1 to move it, as long as I click anywhere in the image or on my canvas, it'll move. Now that you may see like a lot of blinking and stuff like that going on, which is smart guides, which we had in Illustrator, and I suggested I was turning them off. I'm going to turn them off here too. So if I go to, it doesn't really matter either way, but I'm going to go to View and then Show and click on Smart Guide so they're off. Just so I don't get quite so much meaningless visual feedback. All right, so you just activate the one that you want to move that layer, right? If I want to move, you can activate 2 layers at once, right? If I just shift in Adobe is add, right? I can then both layers are active, right? Now the background layer you can move, but at the moment it's locked because it's most likely that people would be moving it by accident. If I try to drag on it, it will say, could not use the move tool because the layer is locked, all right? I can unlock it just by double clicking on the background layer, and then it becomes layer 0, all right? And I can move it, but then it just leaves this, you know, this transparent grid that represents that there's nothing there, which probably is a mistake, right? So I'm just going to Control Z a couple times until that's the background again. All right, you can move these guys up and down by, if I click on layer 1 and just drag up, see the little line lights up there? Now the layer 1's on top. Drag it down, I can put it behind layer 2. So when you're painting, clearly you have to remember, it's the most common mistake sort of beginners have is just forgetting what layer they're on, not being conscious of this. All right. If you want to move, rotate, or scale a layer, the contents of a layer, right? This is the most commonly asked question. It's Control T, right? So I hit Control T, and I get this traditional looking bounding box, right? And it lets me scale it. Or if I put my cursor, just like rotating or scaling something in Illustrator, if I let my cursor hang off the bounding box handle by 1/4 of an inch or so, I can then rotate. All right. So let's move, rotate, and scale. The scale, this is another thing that changed, that was one way forever and recently changed. The scaling is proportionate, right? See, it's not stretching one way or the other. I'm scaling it with constraint, proportion constraints turned on. It stays the same. It used to be up until this version of Photoshop that it would be unconstrained, meaning you could stretch it vertically or horizontally, and you had to hold down Shift to unconstrain. Okay, but now you had to hold down Shift to constrain it. Sorry, but now Shift unconstrained it. So if I push down Shift now, I can stretch it like this. Okay, usually you want it to be constrained. You want to scale things without distorting them. All right. Now, one thing here is that it won't let you continue on until you accept this transform. All right. And up at the top, you'll see this little no and yes thing. The checkbox means yes, and the slash means no. All right. This occurs a couple of times in Photoshop. This phenomenon, when this occurs up here, when you're editing text and when you're transforming an object like we are now. I don't, there might be another case, but I think it's just those two. All right, so I have to hit the check up there, or I can hit enter on the numeric keypad, and that will also do it. Okay, escape will cancel it. All right, so Control T. Control T is an easy thing to forget, but it's found under edit and then free transform. Right, and you see down the right side is all the keyboard shortcuts. Control T right there. All right. Let's look at everything in the layer palette. All right, I think it's worth doing. First of all, across the top, don't use this. What this does is it filters what kind of layers the layer palette is showing. So if you were working with type a lot, for example, and you want to only see type layers, you could turn off the image layers. Okay. Although they've changed this slightly. It used to be that if you uncheck them, oh, there it is. So, I filtered it so it's not showing paint layers, which is the only thing I have at the moment. All right. Okay, or if I turn them all off, then it goes back to none of them being filtered. So at any rate, we're not working with such complicated files here that you're ever going to need to deal with this. All right. Now, a lot of stuff, see how all these things are grayed out at the moment? That's because I have no active layer. A lot of things won't work in Photoshop, generally speaking, if you don't have some layer active. So I'm going to make sure my layer 2 is active. All right. Now, next thing here is where it says normal. Okay. So that we talked about this a little bit. That's our blending modes. And if I go through it, you can see that it does some interesting stuff. Right. And again, it's the blending mode is the name of the algorithm that dictates how the colors in the layer you're on interacts with the colors that are below it. All right, and they're going to look kind of different depending on the colors on the two layers. There are actually somewhere I have a they're actually kind of like mathematical formulas, like background color times 2 divided by foreground color, stuff like that. They're actually literally kind of like mathematical um, calculations. But for the time being, we will actually use them, but for the moment, just leave it normal. Opacity, we can make the layer more transparent or less opaque. See, I turned it down so I can see through it. Right below it is fill, okay? And at the moment, it will do the same thing as opacity, okay? It's because fill is, if we have layer styles, like drop shadow, bevel, and emboss, all stuff we're going to do, if we have those applied to a layer, opacity will turn down everything on the layer, including the layer styles, whereas fill will only turn down the number 2 here. But if I had a drop shadow on it or whatever, that wouldn't get turned down. So with layer styles, these are different. At the moment, they're not. All right. And then the last thing on the top here is this lock, and there's a bunch of them. All right. And there's only two, you can lock you can make it so you can paint on it but not move it. You can make it so you can move the layer but not paint on it, or vice versa. But at any rate, I never use these middle ones. The only ones that are useful are the ones on either end, in my opinion. Okay. The one on the right end is just a padlock. That means you can't do anything to the layer. Okay. Can't do it because the layer is locked. All right. So if you made some layer perfect and you just want to lock it so you don't screw it up by accident or whatever, you can just lock the layer. But the one that I seem to use, I don't actually do that very often, no. But the one on the left is lock transparent pixels, which seems kind of obscure, but it's actually functionally useful. What it does is any pixel that's transparent stays transparent, and anyone that's opaque stays opaque. But you can paint all over it. Like, for example, if I just got black and painted on this letter 2, okay, so it only paints where there already is something. Okay? And that's actually a useful feature. All right, turn that off though. So that's everything on the top. Down on the bottom, we have this FX thing, all right, which is layer styles, which we will go through in great detail later on. This is masks, creates a mask on a layer, right? This is adjustment layers. It's all things like this image adjustments I mentioned up here, but instead of just executing on the layer, it's like a special layer that affects only what's below it, but in a non-destructive fashion. So that's a useful thing. The next one over is a folder, lets you create folders or groups in here where you can, just to keep your layer palette organized. It's when you're working with complex images in Photoshop, particularly ones that have a lot of type on it, it's easy to get 100 layers or something in a Photoshop document. So sometimes keeping them in folders is useful. And the next one is create a new layer that we already looked at, and then the trash can, which if I click on it, it's delete layer 2. Okay, so it's deleted. I'm going to Control Z that. Or you can just drag a layer into the trash can, and then you don't have to respond to the message there for whatever reason. It's a little different. All right, let's look at different ways to join layers together. Now, usually it's worthwhile to keep everything on a separate layer, but sometimes, like if you draw a whole tree with 5,000 maple leaves, and however, for whatever reason, each one's on a separate layer, and you don't ever expect to want to change them independently again, maybe it would be smart to move all the maple leaves onto one layer. The reason for that is layers take up memory. Okay, if you look down the very bottom of the screen, it says doc, and then mine at the moment says 6.44 megabytes. Yours is probably the same there, and this part might be a little different, but that 6.44 megabytes is the size of a file. It's 5 by 5 inches at 300 pixels per inch, inch in the RGB color space, it makes a file that's 6.5 megabytes. Okay. Then there's a slash and a bigger number, and that's including the layers. All right. So you can see that it's more than twice as big. So at the moment, and the more layers we add on, the bigger it gets. So you might want to at least not have a lot of empty or useless layers. So we can just right click on a layer and you will see a delete layer is an option. Right? Do I want to delete it? Yes, or Control Z. Or you can right click on a layer and merge down if I want to set it down on top of the layer below it. So I do that, and now layer 1 and 2 are one layer, right? And unless it was something you just recently did, that I can Control Z. There's no, take them back apart again, right? The places where the 2 goes over the 1, that 1 is deleted there, right? It's been replaced. So don't do that unless you intend to. We also have merge visible, which will put all the layers together. I don't want that, right? You want to keep your layered document, right? Because that's what makes it editable. If I give this, if this was a freelance job that I gave to a customer, and like I would normally, they don't want a layered Photoshop document because they probably don't have Photoshop or don't know how to use it. So I would give them a JPEG, right? I would just go File, Export, or is it Save As? Forget at the moment. Yeah, File, Save As, JPEG, right? And that would give them a flattened file. But if like in a year or two they come back and say, hey, can you change the spelling on this or move this or that or whatever, if I didn't have a layer Photoshop document, I'd kind of have to sort of start over from scratch most of the time. So, but I just go, I would just have given it a name that told me what job it was in, and I would just open the Photoshop file back up, and I would still be able to edit it, right? So, so merge visible, and then if I activate 2 layers and go here, you'll see merge layers, and that means merge the active layers. So put those 2 together. All right, so we're seeing kind of a lot of different ways to skin the same cat. That was disgusting, but let's see. Flatten image merges all the layers, same as merge visible in this case, because they're all visible. Okay. Well, that brings up another point. The eyeball on the left side, right? You might want to turn on and off the contents of the layer, right? Sometimes particularly when you have a lot of layers with small elements, sometimes these little thumbnails don't contain enough information that you can really see what's on them. They're just like little tiny things. So just turn the eye off and on, and while looking at your image will usually make it pretty obvious if there's anything there. Okay. If I hold down Alt and click on the eye, it turns off all the other layers, which is frequently useful too. Okay. And when I say like right click on the layer to see this, that's pretty much the same as the layer palette menu. That's when I say right click on the layer, I mean this area here. Okay. Right clicking on the icon of the layer is different, right? And it doesn't really give you, it's just details about the thumbnail size and stuff like that. Okay. So right clicking on the name, that does give it, but you can usually change the double clicking on the name lets you change the name of this. I frequently do name my layers in Photoshop just to keep things organized. Particularly sometimes customers want the layered Photoshop document because they might have an in-house graphics person and want to be able to edit it later on. And in that case, I frequently group and name all my layers so they know what's going on when they open it up without having to do a lot of detective work. Okay, so let's see. See if I forgot anything. All right, let's look at creating text on the layer. Right? Just going to include that because text makes a new layer. It's relatively straightforward because it's very similar to text in Illustrator. So if I take the type tool and just click on my image, okay, it gives me that lorem ipsum thing, right? And we need, let's see, we need the character palette, all right? There's probably a workspace up here for, not really, but I'm not seeing the character palette at the moment. So I'm going to go Window, Character, right? And here we have, yeah, okay, all right, it was icon there. So here we have the character palette, okay? And it's laid out just like it was in Illustrator, right? First, we have our fonts. I happen to be in Arial bold, okay? Now these fonts are not specific to Photoshop. These are just the fonts that are on whatever computer you're using them with. So, you know, it's the same. It's going to be the same list of fonts that you found in Illustrator, or Word or PowerPoint or whatever. So here we have our type size, and there's some presets there, but you're not limited to those. You can type in, you know, 220 or whatever. That's really big. Maybe I'll go down to, and it's measured in points. I'll go to 50. All right. The next thing here is leading, right? Vertical spaces between lines of type. I'm just going to go through this kind of quickly because we already did it in Illustrator. I'm just going to hit enter here, so it's on 2 lines. All right. Now, one thing about let me move these guys out of the way a little bit. One thing about editing type is that if I go, you do not, I think I said the same thing about Illustrator also, is that you do not need to do this if you're editing the whole piece of type, right? You just need to be on a text layer, right? And in the character palette, okay? So I don't need to, you only would drag over letters if you're trying to edit some of them independently from the other ones, okay? And it can even create some issues, like if I just click like this, so I have this little text insertion marker, like I'm trying to add a letter or something like that. Then I'm editing type, but I have no type selected, which means whatever I do up here, it's not actually going to change anything. So anyway, just remember that just to be on the type layer, that's all you usually need. Okay, so current, but however, the one time you do need to do that is with kerning, right? Because with kerning, it expects you to take the type tool and click on type tool and click on one spot to indicate what space between the 2 characters you want to kern or tighten up horizontally. And when you get out of that, tracking, right, is increasing or decreasing horizontal word and letter space. Okay, this is vertical or horizontal scaling, which you generally don't want to do, and then baseline shift, which will let you move exponents and stuff above, up, or move anything above or below the baseline. And here's a place to put the color in. Okay, if you go back to the type tool, if I change it here, unless they changed it in Photoshop, let's see. Oh, how interesting. Okay, it used to, before this version, for some reason I just had a feeling, if you changed this color up here was only for type that you hadn't made yet, and you had to go to the character palette to change it. But now it seems that that is different. Yep, for sure. So that's not really so necessary, but here's a place now also to change the color. All right, so that's using type. And you can also scale type by doing Control T, right? And the number will change here, right? And then you have to hit the check. Oh, so let's, I mentioned before that the other time you see that check up there is if you're editing type. So see if I click here, then it appears check or no check to not take the edit. Type is pretty straightforward. I don't think there's too much we have to do with it. Oh, one thing that a mistake people make quite often is they try to paint on a type layer. All right, see in the layer palette, the big T there, that means it's a text layer. And you can't paint on that layer. Paint above it or paint below it, right? Keep this for the text. You can rasterize the layer and then paint on it, but that makes it so it's no longer editable type, and usually you don't want to do that. So for example, if I just get my paintbrush and try to paint on this, see there's a little no thing, the icon. And if I try to paint, it says the type layer must be rasterized before proceeding. The text will no longer be editable. Rasterized type. A lot of times students say yes to this without really reading it and understanding the implications. Okay, so if I say here, just watch the layer palette. If I say okay, there's now I can paint on that layer, great, but there's no longer a big T, and this is not editable type anymore. It's just pixels. So I'm going to undo that. Okay, until I get the T back. Now, there might be reasons why you want to rasterize a layer. Like, for example, if I want to run some filter on the type, like let's say filter liquefy. Okay, and it says the type layer must be rasterized or converted to a smart object before proceeding. If rasterized, the text will no longer be editable. I'm going to say rasterize, and then I can smear the type around. Okay, this is a whole other thing, this interface, but right, I wouldn't be able to do that without rasterizing it. I'm going to undo that to get the T back. And let's see. I think that's enough for the moment. Let's hand this thing in. I mean, it's nothing attractive, but just to represent that you got through the wall and everything like that. I mean, if you want to make it more attractive, that would be good. So let's save it as a JPEG, right? If you were to post a Photoshop file, I don't think you can post it on the bulletin board at Blackboard as a image. You would have to put it in as a file, and I'd have to open it in Photoshop. So we'll just put them in as JPEGs. All right. So File, Save As, and right down there you'll see JPEG. Okay. And then name it whatever you want to name it, and put it where you know where it is, and then hand that into the thread. Okay. And next we'll go on to layer styles, because they're really useful in Photoshop.